Hello everyone! In today's video, I'll be doing a VOD review for the Bali ABP 2022 Finals, which is the Asian British Parliamentary Championship. Of course, I think it's appropriate to start with the current world champions David and Toby, and analyze their strategy from one of the positions with the least amount of uncertainty, at opening government. I think this would be a good example of how to control a debate by establishing what we would call a very powerful frame. So before the next portions of the video, please pause first and watch the PM, LO, and DPM speeches where they will debate the motion on this House prefers a world where valorized national heroes in history are morally flawed instead of morally good. The instruction I would give is to pay particular attention to the context and problem that David sets up in the PM speech, how this affects the persuasiveness of the LO speech, and then see how Toby responds by bringing back David in the most pressuring way possible. So go ahead and pause the video here and continue once you are done. Alright, notice that David starts off with setting up an incredibly precise comparative. That this debate is primarily about a world where heroes are portrayed as imperfect or morally flawed, not necessarily morally evil, versus a world where heroes are portrayed as almost perfect or absolutely or predominantly morally good. This is set up through the explanation that states most likely institute this glorification through whitewashing or censoring the bad these figures do, by rationalizing their actions for the sake of preserving this narrative of moral goodness, and by demonizing other parties that threaten this narrative of moral goodness. Now this is brilliant, because these mechanisms specify the most likely manifestation of the narrative for opposition, thus prompting them to resolve these problems or spin it in some way. David explains it in a way to show that these mechanisms are inherent to the incentives that surround this narrative, which is basically the frame that is being pushed. Furthermore, note that this comparative is essential for the first argument that David runs in his speech, which is that the process of glorifying heroes as morally good entrenches authoritarian regimes in their discrimination. So David here sidesteps a lot of the hullabaloo of whether the portrayals are good or bad in general, by instead anchoring the discussion on the process of how these narratives are pushed, which makes the debate more concrete in its outcomes and goals. So immediately from the beginning, the metrics of harm and success are clear from David's speech. This leads me on to an important junction in the speech. Right now, you might already be asking what the comparative would look like. And David gives, in my opinion, a very subtle but very important answer within his POI. Bea from closing opposition raises the POI. Then, would they still be considered as national heroes in your model? Of course, this is a valid and good POI, because even a morally imperfect portrayal of heroes would still include some degree, or would possibly include some degree of glorification, because you're still calling them a hero. This POI effectively prompts government to be clear on the extent they are willing to tolerate, which gives room for opposition to embrace the hardline stance of saying heroes should unambiguously and unanimously be glorified, to avoid these tiptoey stances, since it's implied that this balance of the narrative is impossible. So how does David respond to this? David says, well, we usually don't have any choice because they are so ingrained in our history. He is saying here that the context of the debate is an endemic reality in which they will be valorized no matter what, which reinforces the precise comparative that I was mentioning earlier. More importantly though, what is implicit in this answer is that Gov here is that a narrative of being morally flawed is the counter-narrative to the inherent unfixable characteristic of them being valorized at all to begin with. So even if David doesn't elaborate that much yet in the PM speech on how this counterfactual can be sustained and how it will hold leaders to account, he has already effectively set the stage for what the problem must be and how it must be resolved in the debate. That there is an innate tendency to over-glorify leaders that leads to the many problems he argues in his speech. So let's proceed here. Notice how Shireen, at leader of opposition, as a consequence of the setup initiated by Prime Minister, has to clarify the extent to which the moral goodness outweighs the flaws of these heroes. They do this by mitigating these moral flaws by explaining that these are relatively less controversial, and by emphasizing the significant contributions that they have made for the sake of national unity, which override many of these moral flaws. Now, this is a valid and a very good challenge, as it attempts to take advantage of the issue that the comparative of morally flawed heroes is also weighing some events more than others in the national history. So the claim is that this is still biased, or even more so biased in its own way. And of course, it's a good strategy for opposition to explain that we can't have this balance. We must be unambiguously morally good to be able to claim the benefits of national unity, prompting government to demonstrate that they are not as divisive as opposition claims. So how does Toby at DPM respond to this? Remember David's POI answer to closing opposition earlier? David said that we have no choice but to valorize these individuals because of how integral and inseparable they are to national history. This response from Toby, which we can read here, leverages David's initial response on the endemic reality point to a significant degree by emphasizing that it is not within opposition's control on how they can pick and choose which relatively less controversial heroes they can defend. But actually, Toby's response doesn't stop here at all. He even introduces an even more specific comparative that puts a lot more pressure on the op comparative, that the types of heroes that you glorify as morally good become transcendental and too big to fail, whereas the types of heroes you glorify as morally flawed on government are the ones that magnify grassroots contributions that are more representative of people's histories. Eventually, this one response balloons into an entire new argument, an entire new extension from Toby's speech, wherein he's saying that morally ambiguous portrayals allow people to hold more negotiating power in the history-writing reconciliation process. So in effect, Toby is just saying here that portrayals become less biased and more accurate, and thus more unifying as a consequence. And in my opinion, I think this one argument, this one response, is just stellar craftsmanship and strategy, because you're spinning the argument that was presented by Op. You're also directly responding to their comparative and showing why it's important for you to have this ambiguous portrayal, and instead of allowing for a unanimous portrayal that allows the same problems that the Prime Minister's speech had from the very beginning. So what have we learned from today? At opening government, the context that you will set up and the way that you will explain the problem from that context contributes to the way that you will explain your arguments and the way that you will respond to the other team's challenges. Specifically, the opening gov team in this round was able to demonstrate that the context clarifies and it sets the stage for what the comparative of the round is, thus necessitating that this must be what the debate is above, or what the debate is about above all other things. This allows you to anchor your arguments on concrete outcomes, and it allows you to avoid the uncertainties of other teams eventually trying to narrow or clarify what the debate is, because this is impossible without having to respond to your comparative first. Alright, that should be it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.